Hey guys, it's Grace. Today we are on lesson 3 and we're going to be covering for loops and functions. We're going to be using them to print out more things like shapes and other cool stuff. So let's go ahead and get started. So first off, let's write a program that prints out the following triangle. So the triangle we have here looks like this. It's basically a 4x4 triangle. In the first row, we have 1 star. In the second row, we have 2 stars. In the third row, we have 3 stars. And in the fourth row, we have 4 stars. So this is basically what we want to print. Now, we could do this line by line, right? We can just print out a string of characters for every single line. But what if I want to print out a way bigger triangle? Then it's kind of difficult to write so many print statements, right? So that's what we're going to be using a for loop for. Now we're going to cover this a few lessons later more in detail, but just know that a for loop, what it does is it repeats some sort of task however many times that you specify it to. So you can imagine that it will come in pretty helpful for this problem, right? So let's go ahead and create a program and start coding. Okay, so let's start thinking, how do we want to approach this problem? Well, first of all, we know there are 4 lines. So maybe instead of writing 4 lines of print statements, we can use a for loop to repeat some task 4 times. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to write a for loop that runs 4 times, 1 time for every single line. And this is what the syntax of a for loop looks like. Once again, I'm not going to go too into detail yet, as we will cover this a few lessons later. But basically what this means is that I starts at 1, and then I is less than equal to 4, and then we add 1 to I each time. So I starts as 1, then it becomes 2, 3, 4. So it runs from 1 to 4, which if you count is 4 times. So let's add a comment here saying for loop to print every line. Okay. Oh, right. So now we have a for loop that will print out 4 lines. But the problem is we can't just put a single statement here like print out this star. Why is that? Because we're just going to get a column of 4 stars. And that's not what we're trying to do. In fact, every single line is not the same as the next. So then let's see what we can observe. Let me enumerate these lines. So this is line 1, this is line 2, this is line 3, this is line 4. Now, try looking at the line number and then the number of stars in that line and see, can you find a relationship between them? Because once we find this relationship, it's going to make everything a lot easier. So take a few seconds. All right. If you notice that the number of stars in each line is the same as the number of the line, then you're correct. So in the first line, it's obvious we have 1 star here. In the second line, we have 2 stars. In the third line, we have 3 stars. And then in the fourth line, we have 4 stars. All right. So basically, if we know the line number, we know how many stars we want to print out in that line. Now let's go back to our program. So obviously, we're going to be printing different things each line. So let's remove this statement. And then the number of stars we're going to be printing is equal to I. Now, once again, I can't explicitly create a string where I have the number of stars that I'm going to print out because I don't know. However, I do know the number of stars is going to be equal to I. So here I can repeatedly print out I stars. Now, repetition once again. So we're going to use another for loop inside this outer for loop. And this is what we call nested for loops. Once again, we'll touch on that later. So basically what I would be saying is for every line, I'm going to print out I number of stars. So J will go from 1 to I, which is I stars, right? And in this for loop with J, I will print out a star. And notice here, I don't use the print new line method. I just use the regular old print method because I'm trying to print all the stars on the same line. But after I finish printing out the stars, I want to go to the next line. And then after I print out a new line, this is the end of the iteration of the for loop. Then I go back up here again, as long as I is less than or equal to 4. Okay, so just take a quick few seconds, look over this yourself. It's a rather new topic, so make sure you understand the logic behind it. All right, and then let's run this program. Very nice. We get the exact same thing that was here. So we have this right triangle, 4 by 4. And of course, we can change the number of rows we want. So let's say that maybe I want a 10 by 10 triangle. All right, and there's the 10 by 10 triangle. And then let's try something even bigger. It might be a bit slow because this printing to the console is actually slow. But let's see. All right, and here you can see what I mean by it's slow. You could actually see it actively printing out every single star because we're printing out that many statements. And in the end, we have a pretty big triangle. It's 50 by 50 most likely. All right, very cool. So now let's flip around this triangle. Let's write a program that prints out the reverse of the previous one. All right, so we're going to need to think a little bit differently this time. We cannot print out the stars first, right? Instead, we have to print out the spaces before the stars. So why don't we do the same thing? Let's take a look at each line and find the relationships between, the number of spaces and the number of stars. So once again, 4 lines. Now here we have 3 spaces. Here we have two spaces. Here we got one space, and here it's just 0. Okay, and then the number of stars, we have 1, 2, 3, 4. So take a few seconds to ponder over this, see if you can find any sort of relationship between the numbers, because this relationship will be key. Okay, if you notice that the number of spaces and the number of stars add up to 4, that is correct. And if you also notice, the number of stars in each line is still the same as the line number itself. So that's super important. So then basically, if we know the number of stars, then the number of spaces is equal to the line number minus the numbers. Oh, sorry, it's equal to 4 minus the line number. Right? Okay, so we know this now. Then let's try and program this. So, let's revert this for loop to run to four times. So we still want a for loop for printing every single line. All right. Now, here, we want to print spaces first. In the previous problem, we could just print out the stars and we'd be done. Here, we must print out the number of spaces. And remember, as I have written here, the number of spaces is equal to 4 minus the line number. So how about we calculate this and store it in a variable? So the number of spaces is equal to 4 minus the line number, which is I. And then the number of stars, we already know, it's still equal to I. So first we want to repeatedly print out spaces, and then we want to repeatedly print out stars. So this makes me think that we're going to need 2 for loops in here. First, one to print the spaces, and then one to print out the stars. So let's write the first for loop. So J is going to go from 1 to the number of spaces. Then we're going to print out the space. Okay, now let's do the stars. All right, and then after we print everything on this line, we're going to print out a new line. And then we're going to go again to the beginning where I equals 2 and so on until it reaches 4. So once again, take a few seconds and look at this and make sure you understand the logic that went behind this program. It's pretty short and simple, but it does require quite some thinking. Okay, now let's just go ahead and run this. All right, nice. We get exactly the same output as this picture here, the screenshot. And then once again, just for the sake of it, for fun, let's try bigger numbers, like maybe 12. Oh, and in this case, then for the number of spaces, you want to change it to 12 minus I. And there we go, a nice 12 by 12 right triangle, but reversed. And then let's try a bigger number. 50. Let's see. Same problem here. You have to change spaces to 50 minus I. My bad. But notice how you can kind of see the cursor moving. Let's see that again. You can see the cursor moving as it's printing out the spaces. So that's kind of cool, right? But it is a little slow. So don't make your numbers too huge if you're doing some printing activity like this. Okay. So now let's write a program that prints out the following Christmas tree. And so it looks like this. All right, so let's go ahead and hop on to Replit and let's create a new program. All right, so let's take a look at this tree. Well, for sure, we probably don't want to print this line by line. And by that, I mean explicitly typing out all the spaces and asterisks. That would be really inefficient. And if we look really closely here, you can kind of observe a pattern. So one thing we can first of all notice is that there's 4 segments in this tree, right? And they're all kind of triangular shaped. So each one we can also observe has a height of 4 stars. So now with this information, why don't we create variables that store these values? One for the number of segments in the tree, and then one for the height of each segment. So how we're going to do that is by declaring final variables. And you can kind of think of these as constants, like you would in an equation. It's a value that you can always be sure of, that you always know. And they're usually capitalized, so segments is 4. And then the height of each segment is also 4. So we have these out here to refer to. We always know their values. Okay, now let's go back to this tree. So besides that, what other patterns can we observe? How about we count the number of stars in every single row? So 1, 3, 5, 7, 3, 5, 7, 9, then 5, 7, 9, 11, 7, 9, 11, 13. And then let me group the numbers that are in one segment together. Okay. Try looking at these numbers, see if you can observe some sort of pattern. Well, you might have noticed something like every 4 lines, they're all odd numbers. And they're all consecutive odd numbers. So 1, 3, 5, 7 is a group of consecutive odd numbers. And then 3, 5, 7, 9 is also a group of consecutive odd numbers, and so on. And something else you may have noticed is that the first segment starts with 1 star. The second one starts with 3 stars, and then the third one starts with 5, and the last one with 7. And these are also consecutive odd numbers. And what else do we know? Well, let's label each of these segments. Let's label this segment 1, segment 2, segment 3, segment 4. Well, now something else we can say is that the number of stars in the first row of each segment is equal to 2 times the segment number minus 1. Okay? So now let's go back to the main file and try and set this up. So here, if you haven't, here, we're doing a repetitive task where we're trying to print out 4 segments and then 4 lines in each of these. Now, we haven't really covered these in detail yet, but we're going to be using what we call a for loop to help us with this problem. And so what a for loop does is it basically repeats a task this many number of times that you want. So here, I first want this for loop to run for 4 times, 1 for each segment. So this basically means that I is going to iterate from 1 to segments, which is 4. So this is 4 times in total. And then for every segment that I have, then I want to print out 4 lines within that segment. So I'm going to use another for loop in here. I'm going to call it a variable line. This tells us what line we're on. And this is going to run for seg height number of times, which is 4. So if you think about it, if this runs 4 times and this runs 4 times, we can multiply those two together, and everything here will print out exactly 16 lines, which is what we need in our output. All right, so then let's figure out, how do we determine how many spaces and stars we need to print out? Well, first things first, we already know that the number of stars in the first row of each segment is equal to 2 times the segment number minus 1. So let's store that value in a variable so we can use it as we're printing out every line. And this will be very helpful to us because in the segment, we know that the number of stars are just consecutive odd numbers. If we know the number of stars in the first row, then we can add on 2 to get the second row, and so on. So let's call a variable stars. It's equal to 2 times I minus 1. All right, so going back here. Then let's count the number of spaces we have. So here we have 6 spaces, and then we have 5, then we have 4, and then 3. Here we have 5, 4, 3, 2, then 4, 3, 2, 1, then 3, 2, 1, 0. Now, one issue you may have thought of by now is that we kind of need to know how many stars or spaces are at the widest part of the tree. Why is that? You can kind of think that we're bounded by a box. So imagine that this whole thing is in a box. Well then, the number of stars here, it's the width of our box. And so the number of spaces we're printing, then if we draw a line down the middle, is the half the width of the box minus half the number of stars in the current row, right? Think about it for a second. Okay, so this tells us we need to define a variable that tells us what the maximum width of our tree is. And we don't really need to do that for height. We don't care because we have the 2 for loops to take care of that. So we already cannot exceed 16 rows, but it's the width that's the difficulty. So now, outside my for loops, I'm going to declare max width. And if we go back and count this, this is equal to 13. All right, So going back to my for loops, for each line, I'm going to create a blank string that's going to store all the characters that go in this row. So all the spaces and the stars that I need. All right, so spaces come before the stars first. So let's start by adding the correct number of spaces we need to the row. And how we calculate the number of spaces, we just discussed. The number of spaces is equal to half of the maximum width minus half of the number of stars in that row. And so we already know this out here. We have a variable for the number of stars. And the max width is here, so that's all taken care of. So for this many times, we're going to add on a space. All right. Now we're going to add on the stars. Well, the number of stars we already know because it's in a variable. So this loop is just going to run for the stars number of times. All right. And maybe you're wondering, what about other spaces here? So what I've done is I've only printed out all this every time. What about this chunk here? Well, if you think about it, it doesn't really matter, does it? There's nothing that comes after the space, so there's no need to print it at all. So here we're only concerned about the spaces preceding the star and then the stars themselves. All right, so here we have finished forming our row. Then we're going to print it out on a new line. All right, and then one important step is that we need to update the number of stars. And remember, the stars are consecutive odd integers, so all we have to do is add 2. So basically, at the end of every line in a segment, we create the row of characters, then we print it out, and then we update the number of stars so we can use it for the next line in that same segment. And then once we finish printing all the lines in that segment, we're going to move on to segment 2. And so the number of stars will be whatever this value is. And then we're going to print out 4 lines once again and update stars. And stars is going to be a different value from the corresponding line in the previous segment. So for instance, in segment 1, line 1, I would have had 1 star. But in segment 2, line 1, my number of stars would be equal to 3, because this depends on I, which is the segment number we are currently on. And since I changes, the number of stars we start off with in the top row in each segment also changes. Okay. Now, by the end of these for loops, we will have printed this top part of the tree. Now, we just got to do this bottom part, the trunk, or the stand, or whatever. So once again, all we are concerned about is the number of spaces and the stars. So the number of spaces here is 6. And then we print out 1 star. Also 6 here, we print out 1 star. And then here we have 3 spaces, and then we print out these 7 stars. So let's go back and do that. So the trunk has 2 rows, so we can use a for loop to do this printing 2 times. So this for loop will run for 2 times. Then I'm going to create a blank string called row to store the characters that go in that row. By the way, you will want to change the iteration variable in lines 13 and 16 to J, because we already have I defined here. Java's going to get confused. So J is going to run for max width over 2 times. And we can kind of see that, seeing that the stars are only printed out halfway in the middle of max width. So we're going to be adding on spaces. And then at the end, after we finish adding on spaces, we'll add on a star. And then we're going to print out that row. Okay, so we print out this trunk row 2 times. Now we're just going to print out the final base. We can just do this explicitly. It's just 3 spaces and 7 stars. All right, there we go. So take a quick look over this code and see if it made sense to you. As you can see, there's actually a lot of math involved in this. And it kind of makes sense, seeing that here we're sort of printing out a geometric shape. So this required looking for patterns, coming up with relationships for certain numbers as well. All right, and there we go. We get our Christmas tree right here. It looks exactly the same as the example diagram we had. Okay, our next step is going to be, we're going to convert this into a function, or what we call a method in Java. And so what a method does is it basically just allows the code to be more readable, reusable, easier to debug. So I'm going to declare a new method here. And for now, it's not really necessary to know what all this means. But the main important things are that, first of all, you have to define the return type of the method because you think of it as a function. You give it some sort of input, and then it comes out with an output. But you want to know what kind of output you're getting. Like, you could be getting a string, an integer, whatever. Here in this case, we have a void. And that means that this doesn't return anything. And that makes sense, right? Because we're just printing things out when we make the tree. Printing is not the same as returning. And in these parentheses, usually what goes in here are our parameters. And these are basically our input variables that go in our function. Then, of course, like anything in Java, we have to give it a name. And here it's going to be called make tree. Now I'm going to copy paste this stuff here. And then, how do I use this method? I'm going to call it in my main method right here. So I'll call make tree, just like that. Now let's run this. All right, and we still get the same thing. We still get this tree. Okay, All right then, let's wrap this up. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys next time. Bye!